Hello everyone and welcome back to Tech with Enki. In today's video, I'm going to propose a solution to the exercise Numbers from CS50's Introduction to Programming with Python. Yeah, I know this is not really spelled as numbers, but permit me to just call it like that. I really don't know how to pronounce this. I'm excited to solve this exercise today with you, and my hope is just that I could provide you with a few tips or ideas that you could use while solving the exercise later on by yourself. So that said, let's look at the exercise and see what's expected from us. So if I scroll down up to around this point, let me skip this first and then come to this line, we see that we're expected in a file called Numb3Rs to implement a function called validate that expects an IPv4 address as an input to a string and then returns true or false respectively if that input is a valid IPv4 address or not. And then we are also expected to structure Numb3Rs as follows, wherein we are welcome to modify the main and or implement other functions as we see fit, but we may not import other libraries, and we are welcome but not required to use RA and sys. And so this is what our code should look like. We import RA and sys, though for this exercise I'm not going to import sys because I'm not going to use it in our code. Then we'll have a main function which has already been implemented for us. There's not really much to modify here. And we have this function validate which we are supposed to modify, and at the end we call it main. Also, we are expected to do the stats before or after we implement validate in Numb3Rs. Additionally, we are to implement in a file called test_numbers.py 2 or more functions that will collectively test our implementation of validate, each of whose name should begin with test underscore so that we can run the file with pytest of test_numbers.py. We'll be given a few number of hints here, so if I open this, let's see what we have. The first, we are told to recall that the module RA comes with a few methods which could be useful, one of which is search. This already tells us that we could use the method search to solve this exercise. But feel free to look at this link and then look at all the methods that could be helpful, because I can bet you that there are so many methods in RE that could do this as well. Also, we need to recall that regular expressions support quite a few special characters. We remember like the caret symbol, the dollar sign, and all the other symbols. And next, because the backslash in regular expressions could be mistaken for escape sequences, it's best if we use Python word strings to solve this exercise, like you remember for the video in the course. And last but not the least, we are told that we can capture the matches from RA.search if we use parentheses. So let me scroll down to this demo and see what our code should look like, or rather what our output should look like. So in this case, when the code was run and the user entered 1.2.3.4, which is a valid IPv4 address, the return value was true. And this reminds me, we've not yet discussed what a valid IPv4 address is. But then if you read through all of this, you're going to realize that a valid IP address should have this format, and these numbers could range from 0 to 255. So that said, let's go back to our demo. And this time around, when the user ran the code, they entered 127.0.0.1, which is also valid, and so the code returned true. This too is valid, 255.255.255.0, because it's in the range from 0 to 255, and the code returned true. But in this case, the user entered 275.3.6.28, and the return was false. So this tells us that we need to check the 4 values that the user will enter, and if any of these values is not in the range from 0 to 255, then the whole IP address is wrong. And as usual, we're expected to create a library, call it numbers, cd into that library, where we'll create a Python file numbers.py, and also we're expected to create the file test_number.py in this folder. And naturally, before submitting our exercise or our code, we're expected to test it by ourselves, run it a few number of times and check that it returns true when it's supposed to and false when it's supposed to. We've been given a few ideas here of what to test our code with: 127.0.0.1 true and all of these. If the user enters something like hat, which is an invalid string, we should return false. And with our file test_numbers.py, we're going to run it with pytest. The first time all of it should be true. Then we modify our file numbers.py, come back to test, run it. It should be able to catch any errors that resulted from our modifications, and then we correct those errors, run it again, make sure that everything is correct before submitting the assignment. So I think with this the exercise is clear enough, and I'm just going to skip now to VS Code and we'll write the code together. And as you can see, I've already copied and pasted the structure that we're supposed to follow for the file numbers.py. And like I mentioned, I'm not going to use the module sys to solve this, so I just commented it. Might as well just remove it altogether. It shouldn't really matter. So let's come to our function validate. But first, before we implement this function validate, I want to use a Jupyter notebook to show us what our pattern is going to look like, because recall that the most important thing that we need here is the pattern. So in this Jupyter notebook, the first thing we need to do is import array. If I run that, that's settled. Next, I created two variables, and in these variables I saved a valid IP address and an invalid IP address, and I want to use this to devise a pattern that will solve this exercise for us. So to come up with this pattern, I want us to look at this valid IP address, and we're going to move step by step. So looking at this address, we see that the first value I entered here was 0, because we recall that a valid IP address can have values from 0 to 255. And this tells us that a valid IP address should start with a number. So in our pattern, I'll start by using the caret symbol to match the beginning of the string. Then I'm going to enter a range of values from 0 to 9. And this should be able to match every whole digit from 0 to 9. But then we also know that this value could be a lot bigger than 0, because it ranges from 0 to 255. So what I want to do next is to specify that we're expecting either one or many repetitions of this value. So putting this plus sign here tells us that we could have one or more repetitions of any numbers from 0 to 9. And here you might be thinking now that, but then this could mean that this is going to accept values like 1000, 10,000 or million, and we are very sure, we already know that those are not valid values for an IP address. But you don't have to bother about that now. I'm going to solve that later on. So with this, we are certain that our pattern will only accept strings or inputs that start with numbers. But one thing we also need to do is to do not forget that we have to capture this, because we need to use this input later on. And that should settle it for this first digit, which could be a 0 or could be 255 in that range. And next, we see that a valid pattern has a dot before another value. And we recall that to specify that we want an actual dot here, all we need to use is a backslash dot here to specify that we want an actual dot and not just any character. And after the dot, we have another number which could range from 0 to 255. And so we're going to do the same thing that we just did. In parentheses and in square brackets, I'm going to enter a range from 0 to 9, and I'm going to put a plus sign here. And this should capture the second number in the valid IP address. And looking at this, we see that this number is almost the same as this one. So what we can do is just copy this and paste it here. And this means that our pattern expects a dot and one or more repetitions of another number. And if I paste this logic one more time here, we see that we are still expecting a dot, another number, but then I want to end this with a dollar sign. And ultimately, this pattern will tell array.search that a valid address will start with a number and also end with another number. So this should do for a valid IP address. Feel free to try this your own way, because there are a lot of ways that we could do this. You could try this using a \d to check for digits, but like I said, there are a number of ways that you can do this, and so feel free to try it out your own way. So let me run this code cell, and in this other code cell we're going to test our pattern and see if it works just fine. So I'm using an if-else statement. I'm checking the valid address using the pattern that we just made, and if it's true, we'll return, or rather we're going to print valid. But if there's no match, we're going to print invalid. So if I run this other code cell, and as we expected, valid. And this tells us that at the very least, our pattern is able to identify a valid IP address. So let me run this with this invalid IP address and see what happens. So if array.search of pattern invalid IP address print valid, else invalid. If I run this with shift enter, and oh, this tells us that the invalid IP address is actually a valid IP address. So why is that? Well, that's because our pattern is going to match anything that actually looks like a valid IP address. What do I mean? Essentially, our pattern expects a number or one or more repetitions of a number, a dot, another number, a dot, another number, a dot, and then another number. I hope I said that right. But then I guess you understand what I'm trying to say. But it does not check if that number ranges from 0 to 255, which is one thing that we'll need to add in our function validate. But no worries, we're going to solve that later on. And the last thing I want to show you in this code cell is the values that we are capturing when using the parentheses in our pattern. So if I run this code cell, and as you can see, I ran it on our valid IP address, we see that match is a tuple which contains the numbers found in the valid IP address 0, 100, 200, and 255. And I'm sure you already see where I'm heading to, because yes, we're going to use this tuple. We'll iterate over this tuple and check every value in this tuple, making sure that these values lie in the range 0 to 255. If not, our IP address will be invalid. So that's it. All we need to do now is return to our file Numb3Rs and implement our function validate. But then before we do that, I'm just going to copy this pattern that we already have here, and I'm going to paste it in this function. So now that we have our pattern sorted out, all we need to do next is to run array.search. So to do this, I'm going to create a variable, or call it match, to save the groups that array.search is going to capture, and I'll run array.search, and I'll pass as parameters a pattern that we just entered and the parameter IP, which is this parameter right here. So if the user enters a valid IP address, or rather anything that actually looks like a valid IP address, match should contain the groups returned by array.search. But if match is empty, meaning that the user entered something that's incorrect, for example, if the user entered something like cat or dog, we can check that with an if statement. So if not match, and what we want to do is to return false. So in this case, if match is empty, we're going to end the code right here and return false. But if match is not empty and we do have our tuple that we can iterate through, I'm going to use a for loop to iterate over match. So for, let's say, digits in match, match.groups, we need parentheses here, and what we need to do next is to check each of these digits. Just follow along with me for this. So if not, in parentheses, 0 is less than or equal to the int of digits, we should in turn be less than or equal to 255. We're going to return false, else we'll return true. So essentially, with this for loop, we're iterating over the tuple match.groups, checking that each of the values lie between 0 and 225. If that's not the case, we'll return false. This means that the IP address is invalid. But if after checking all of these values, and they in fact lie in the range 0 to 225, outside of our for loop, we're going to return true. So this should do for our function validate. So let me save this, and I'm going to open my terminal, and we're going to test our file Numb3Rs.py, making sure that it actually does work before we go to our file test_Numb3Rs.py. So to do this, I'm going to run python of Numb3Rs.py, and if I press enter, and now we're expected to enter an IP address. Let's say we entered 0.0.0.0. which is a valid address, and when I press enter we have true. Let me run this again, press enter, and this time around let me enter something which is invalid. Let's say 0.3.4.500, and I press enter, we have it as false. So this tells us at the very least that our file numbers.py is working just fine. Now to test this file, we're going to go to our file test_numbers.py, and we're going to write a number of functions to do the test for us. But first, I'm going to close this terminal to give us some space to work. And here I've already written the first line of code from numbers import validate. I believe all of us were already aware of that by now. And next, what I want to do is to write functions to implement our file, or rather our function validate. And remember that check50 is going to look at our file test_numbers.py and make sure that we wrote enough functions test the function validate. But before we go ahead, I want to propose 4 things that we need to check for, which I want to show you in this to-do list I already wrote right here. So first, I think that we need to check that an empty input returns false. Let's say the user enters something like an empty string or enters like ... that should return false. Next, I think it's also important that we check that an invalid input like a string, say the user entered cat, dog, anything like that, returns false. Also, we need to check that a valid address returns true, like 000, or rather 0.0.0.0, or what, 255.255.255.255. And lastly, we need to check that a wrong address returns false. And remember that if any of the 4 values, be it the first, second, third, or fourth, is wrong, then the whole address is wrong. So having that in mind, let's come back to our file test_numbers.py, and I'm going to create a first function. I'm going to call this test of empty, test_empty with 0 parameters. And in this function, I want to assert that validate of, let's say what, an empty string returns false. And we could create a second function like this one. If I copy this, let me come here and paste this also here, and let me change the name of this function. Let's say test_empty2. I want to validate that, let's say ... also returns false. So instead of putting values, the user just left like an empty space, a dot, an empty space, a dot, an empty space, another dot. Next, we need to check for an input from the user like characters, which are not actually numbers. So let me create another function. Let me call this function test_stir with 0 inputs. And in this function, I want to assert that validate of, let's say what, cat is equal to false. Let me put a space right here. And while we're at it, I see a lot of false here, so I guess we might just continue with the false trend. And in our next function, let me call this function test_, let's say what, wrong address with 0 parameters. And in this function, I want to assert that, let's say what, validate of, let's enter something that actually looks like an IP4 address, but which is wrong. So let's say maybe 100.200.300.500 should result to false. Oh, I forgot the equal to sign here. And let me do this one more time. I'm going to copy this and let me paste it right about here. Let me change this name, let's say test wrong address 2. And I want to make sure that regardless of where the wrong number is found, be it at the beginning or at the end of the address, our function still returns false. So here let me say 1000, and let me remove this and say 50, and so this should return to false. And let me paste this one more time here, and I'm going to change this name to, instead of saying wrong address, we want to say valid address. And in this function test of valid address, we want to make sure that the address we're entering is correct. So let's say 100, 200, 300, and let me remove this and say 50. Let me remove this as well and say 30. Oh, so here we had 2 wrong addresses, or rather 2 wrong numbers. Well, that's fine though. And here, instead of returning false, we want to return true, or rather check that the result is true. And I think we've written enough tests for our file test_numbers.py. So let me save this file, open up my terminal once more. And now instead of running Python, we're going to run pytest of test_numbers.py. If I press enter, and as we wanted it and as we expected, 6 passed in 0.03 seconds. I guess that's fast. And with this, we are sure that our function validate works just fine. So to test our test, that sounds a little bit weird. Let's come back to this file numbers.py and modify this a little bit to make sure that our test will fail because of our modifications. So in this case, instead of checking from 0 to 255, let's say we're checking from, or rather we're validating addresses from 0 to 1000. That's quite big, but yeah, that's fine. So let me save that. I'll come back here and I'm going to run pytest one more time. And whoa, we have 2 failed and 4 passed. Let's look at these and see the ones that failed. The ones that failed are test of wrong address and test of wrong address too. And here we already know what happened, but let's come back here and see. So let me scroll and come here. We record that we are validating values from 0 to 1000. And here we have 500, 300, 200, 100, which actually lie within 0 to 1000. And we told validate, or rather, we told pytest that this was going to result to false, but then it resulted to true. And here as well. But I'm pretty sure you already know this is an easy fix. So I'm just going to come back here. We're going to remove this and we're going to put back 255. Save this, come back here, run pytest one more time, and as we expected, 6 passed in what, 0.02 seconds. I think that's faster. I don't really know why, but well, that's faster. So with this, I want to believe we're done with the exercise. We've implemented our files numbers.py and test_numbers.py, and we've made sure that they are working just fine. But if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment sections below and I'll be more than pleased to answer you. If you enjoyed the video, do well to hit the like and subscribe buttons, share it with your friends who are as well taking CS50, and I look forward to seeing you in my upcoming videos. That said, have a good day.